Good evening or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our June MDA Advocacy Institute. Today, we are focusing on diversity in clinical trials, an incredibly important topic. So, appreciate everyone joining us this evening or afternoon for about an hour or so as we discuss ensuring that clinical trials are diverse. I am Paul Melmeyer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy here at the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and I'm going to be your moderator, if you will, for the next little while. So let's start with some introductions and housekeeping, but first let's hit the agenda, I believe. So we'll start with housekeeping and introductions, as I said, and then from there we're going to have kind of two main topics for you all today. The first will be welcoming in Michelle Gadames from Congresswoman Robin Kelly's office. And then in addition, from there, we'll have Jamie Gammerman, who's with the Food and Drug Administration, discuss efforts happening at the Food and Drug Administration pertaining to clinical trial diversity. And then following both of them, we'll be taking your questions. And to move to the next slide, which is our housekeeping slide, I believe, how we can take your questions is ideally through the Q&A box. So if you go down to the bottom right hand of your screen, you see those three little dots there. And if you click on those three little dots, up comes a couple options, and one of them is Q&A. That's the best way to send in questions for me, for our panelists, pertaining to what we're talking about this evening on clinical trial diversity. Now, also, there's the chat box. In the chat box, you can feel free to converse within each other and so forth, but if you can put those questions in the Q&A box, I would appreciate it there. And I'll mention that while we do have that reserved time at the end of our program for questions and answers, we also will be keeping an eye on those questions as they're coming in throughout the presentation. And if they're particularly relevant to what our panelists are discussing in that moment, we may be able to answer them live as we're going along, just to be sure that we are answering the questions you may have as they are coming to us if appropriate. The other thing to mention pertaining to housekeeping is you can click closed captioning on the bottom left hand of your screen there to take advantage of that option. And then finally, I'll also mention that this webinar is being recorded. So we are looking forward to all of you. If there's anything that you happen to miss in today's hour or so, and we're going to be throwing a lot at you, so maybe you won't be getting it all down live, and that's perfectly fine because you can watch the recording, which will be posted on our YouTube on our webpage in just a little while for anything that you happen to miss. And if you have any colleagues or friends who wish they could join this evening but were unable to, feel free to send along the link as well. So I think that takes care of our housekeeping items. So again, just to tell you who we have joining you today, we have myself, there I am, second from the left, as well as Jamie and Michelle, who I already have mentioned is joining us. But I'm very privileged to first hand it over to Sean Hill. Sean Hill is our Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy here at MDA. And Sean, while you'll be introducing Michelle momentarily to discuss the excellent efforts that Congresswoman Kelly is pursuing to make clinical trials more diverse, first I'm going to invite you to say a few opening words if you'd like. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. As I thought about tonight's discussion, one thing came to mind, and is that clinical trials are essentially one of the cornerstones of our healthcare system. How can we move forward without drugs and therapies and treatment modalities unless we have an opportunity to test them on people that would be using these drugs? The unfortunate thing is many of the communities that would benefit from participating in clinical trials are often not allowed to do so. And perhaps allowed isn't a correct word, but certainly experience barriers to participating in clinical trials. And that certainly applies to the neuromuscular disease community. Certainly our community is one that represents rare diseases, and finding therapies for that population is paramount. But we readily do not have access, as well as other marginalized communities, whether that be racial and ethnic groups, older Americans. There tends to be a disconnect between the need to get those people to the trials and what actually is happening. But luckily, these are not insurmountable problems. Certainly, there are efforts underway, both on Capitol Hill and among the federal agencies to try to address these barriers. And so, with that being said, I'd like to turn the floor over to Michelle Galdemayes. Michelle is the Senior Health Policy Advisor in Representative Robin Kelly's office, and Representative Kelly is one of the co-sponsors of the NIH Clinical Trials Diversity Act. Michelle will go into a little bit of detail about that with us, as well as other efforts of Representative Kelly and others on the Hill to address this issue. So that being said, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that introduction, as well as Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Galdames. I'm the new Senior Health Policy Advisor for Congresswoman Robin Kelly, proudly representing the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois for over 10 years. In a world where access to quality healthcare remains uneven and unjust, our office commitment is to have health equity at the center of building a healthcare system that works for everyone. Barriers to care are not just inconvenient, they perpetuate cycles of inequality that impact all of us. The NIH is a critical partner in the efforts to ensure that every one of the Congresswoman's constituents and beyond can access the affordable, high-quality healthcare that they need, just like the FDA is. Next slide. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page on health equity. It's a term and it's a concept that is more than just a nice idea. And I know I'm here, if you're here in this webinar is because I know I'm preaching to the choir, and we're here because we care about health equity, right? So it is an essential component to providing the best possible healthcare to every American. And, health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. And that means that we need to remove obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and the consequences of unjust power imbalances. With that end, clinical trials play a crucial role in advancing medical knowledge, improving patient care, and promoting better health outcomes for all of us. They are an integral part of the scientific process that evaluates the safety and effectiveness of new drugs, treatments, medical devices, and interventions. Next slide. So clinical trial diversity does not usually, we're talking about this because it means that clinical trials are not usually reflecting the populations most affected by the disease or the condition. And we know that diseases or conditions present differently in different population sets, and that the largest demographic participating in clinical trials today are white people, primarily white males. So to produce better science, we need our clinical trials to reflect the populations that are developing treatment for. And here in this slide, I'm just presenting like three examples of many of the misalignment between the prevalence and the representation of clinical trials that I wanted to highlight here today, whether it was through race or the number or even gender, really. So, first one is data based on heart disease, but then the second one is here on rare diseases and how it affects 25 million people in the US and about 400 million worldwide, yet only 5% has maybe 5% of treatments have been approved for that. Next slide, please. Here, I wanted to move over to legislation and what has happened in Congress so far before I go and talk about the work my boss is doing. And so, as a reminder, I think the two critical pieces when it has come to clinical trial diversity in Congress has been the DPIC Act and the NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act that my boss co-leads. But to take a step back, at the end of 2022, the reforms included in the final omnibus reflected major provisions of the DPIC Act, who was co-sponsored by Rep. Kelly. And we're very grateful, and we thank the both the committee staff as well as the staff of Congressman Pallone, Congresswoman Eshoo, and anyone in ENC who really worked towards that. But again, just to really reflect on what has passed in Congress, these provisions are FDA guidance and requirements for certain clinical studies related to an application for a new drug or medical device to include a diversity action plan, meaning that there are goals for enrollment in the study, the rationale behind those goals, and an explanation of how the applicant intends to meet those goals and retain them, right? Funding for community health centers to increase their capacity to participate in clinical trials and research, really. Again, the partners, the trusted messengers are community health centers, physicians, community workers, community health workers. Information is power when we know that. So that's the whole point behind all these efforts. An annual summary from FDA on the progress to increase diversity in clinical trials, as well as public workshops in which FDA solicit input on increasing the enrollment of historically underrepresented populations in clinical studies from stakeholders. Next slide. So now to talk about the NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act of Congresswoman Robin Kelly. This is the piece of legislation that the Congresswoman has been working since the 117th Congress. So this is the second Congress that we introduced this bill. She's co-leading this with Representative Fitzpatrick and Senators Menendez and Collins. This bill would require NIH to work with clinical trial sponsors to develop clear and measurable diversity goals, ensure the availability of less burdensome follow-ups during clinical trials. So fewer follow-ups, or instead of coming in person, it could be a phone participation, extending to weekend hours. We know having a limited 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or Monday through Friday only, sometimes it definitely creates a barrier for folks who have a job or just have other responsibilities, or their caregivers, family members, neighbors, whoever is in that system of support may not be able to accommodate or to, get them to fit within that schedule. So like having an ample or more available hours, it's definitely where just one proof of where can we meet the patient or where the patient's at. To definitely increase the participation of underrepresented population and launch a public awareness campaign across federal agencies. Again, I'm grateful that my fellow panelist is from the FDA as I'm talking about NIH, but I know at HHS broadly, there's many other interagency collaborations that definitely would come at the table who have an interest here. So helping to ensure diversity in clinical trials is an important step towards creating equity across the healthcare continuum. And just really want to emphasize how Congresswoman Kelly will continue to work across the aisle to ensure that the NIH remains a global leader in public health research. She is proud to lead this piece of legislation to build on current efforts at the NIH, which we applaud. We recognize there are those current efforts in place. So this is just to take to the next level to improve outcomes for historically marginalized population. Again, this legislation supports the NIH and community organizations in their efforts to recruit participants that actually reflect the population that will need the treatment. This legislation improves also the data collection practices, and we know that without data, science does not move forward. So definitely improving those practices can make sure that trials are meeting those diversity goals. Next slide, please. And really just coming towards the end of what I want to share, as a patient, you are your best advocate. So talk to your doctor about opportunities in your area to participate in clinical trials, whether they're bringing it up naturally. I think, again, like information is power. So as a patient or as a caregiver, someone in the support system of a patient wanting to participate in clinical trials, ask, right? And so I'm proud that my boss's bill acknowledges that one of the most powerful tools is community-driven information networks, just like MDA. So when constituents are hearing from trusted sources, they feel empowered to make informed decisions about their own health. Congress can do a lot, and my boss says that a lot, but members can't do it all. Congress and their staff need allies in medicine and academia and businesses on the ground to prioritize equity and inclusivity in all clinical trials. So I'm glad my boss and her office are with you in this fight. So thank you very much. My information is in this slide and of course can be shared as a follow-up. Reach out to our office as we are definitely paying close attention, and we want to keep sounding the alarm that is so critical for clinical trials diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. That was an excellent presentation on this incredibly important legislation. Sean, before I pose a question or two to Michelle that we've had in the chat or Q&A, anything that you'd like to conclude yourself with Michelle's presentation?
No, I think it was so needed, so on point. I especially appreciate interjecting the need for, working in community. Like you said, the Congresswoman cannot do herself, the staff cannot do it, but we certainly all have a role to play in moving this forward and in try to achieve diversity and inclusivity in clinical trials. So I wanted to thank Michelle again for her presentation, and we look forward to working with you in the office.
Absolutely. And one of those ways that we actually can all work with Congresswoman Kelly is reaching out to our own representatives and senators. And if only all of us could be in Representative Kelly's district, but I imagine most of us probably are not. So the good news is that we actually have an easy way for you all to tell your representative and your senators, because there's both a House and a Senate version of this bill, to co-sponsor this legislation. That's how we're able to, all of us, show support for a bill that we support and that we want to see become law. So Mark, I'm going to ask if you can put a link in the chat for everybody that takes you to a page where you just put in your address, and it allows you to craft your own message with a little bit of a prompt to build on, but craft your own message to head up to Capitol Hill that encourages your representative, your senators to co-sponsor the legislation. So Michelle, before we let you go, there was a couple good questions in the chat that I want to ask you, and one actually pertains to kind of DEI more generally, and how unfortunately DEI has in some ways become polarized, and there are a few more polarized places than on Capitol Hill these days. And what is lost in some of this is that those really fantastic provisions in the DEPICT Act and some of the things that were included in FDA reforms from 2022 that now Jamie is hard at work implementing, a lot of those provisions were bipartisan, and that they, of course, had to be bipartisan in order to pass Congress. So can you tell us a little bit about how partisan or bipartisan this clinical trial diversity topic is on Capitol Hill? Because we've seen some really unified efforts behind clinical trial diversity actually succeed in just the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. Thank you so much. I would say clinical trial diversity remains a bipartisan issue. I mean, there are other offices in the trench with us as well from both sides of the aisle who are putting out other kinds of legislation as well. And to your point of the polarization of DEI, really, like from a public health standpoint here, like, we then have to become, unfortunately or fortunately, more creative at how to label the those categories. But at the end, it could be just simply summed up by social determinants of health, right? Like, and I think that's maybe just a correct term to just use, right? Like used by agencies, used by public health experts. So we in those determinants, we know how really it can they can impact and become like a feedback loop at the end of the day. So if we're not categorizing specifically or listing, then we may miss a big chunk of data or crucial piece of information. So you are correct, you know, and even in this Congress, we just have to continue to work in bipartisan ways, and sometimes that may mean compromising on what you're trying to refer to, but at the end of the day, the message, the intention is present.
Yeah, very well said. And there's actually another question in the chat that I can certainly help answer. And the question is from Bill, and Bill asks, wasn't there legislation passed in the previous administration for the right to try and participate in clinical trials? So the Right to Try Act was passed by Congress in 2017 or 18, one of those 2 years. I'm blanking on the precise year, but it was the last administration. Now, what the Try Act did, though, was what the Right to Try Act did was try to increase access to investigational therapies outside of clinical trials. So what was being observed is that there were lots of individuals who wanted to participate in a clinical trial, but for one reason or the other couldn't. And usually it was because they didn't meet the exclusion or inclusion criteria, which those very same criteria can sometimes lead to non-diverse clinical trials. So that bill was passed a handful of years ago to try to increase access to these very same investigational therapies outside of clinical trials, not necessarily inside, but outside clinical trials. And so there's still an effort that needs to be had to try to increase the diversity and access to the clinical trials themselves, because the Right to Try Act didn't necessarily resolve that. And for those within the ALS community, the Act for ALS also was very much targeted at this very issue of many individuals wanting to participate in clinical trials, but not being able to. So the way that the Act for ALS tried to solve this was actually by creating a grants program run by the NIH, in which millions of dollars of grants are given out to companies to then allow for them to increase the number of individuals who can access the therapy outside the clinical trial. But none of these things resolve the issues of what's happening inside the clinical trials, and that's why we're emphasizing clinical trial diversity today, trying to make diversity really a centerpiece of the trials within the neuromuscular disease therapeutic development arena going forward. So, Michelle, I just basically answered the question there. I hope you don't mind. I just took that one. I worked on Right to Try a lot and Act for ALS as well, so spent many hours on those two bills. Michelle, I think with that, we can probably just thank you again for the time today. And of course, you're welcome to stick around. I do believe you have potentially a hard cutoff just a little ways into the hour here. So if you want to stick around and listen to Jamie tell us about the fantastic efforts that FDA is undergoing, love to have you join us. But just in case you can't stay, again, very grateful for your time this evening and looking forward to working with you and Congresswoman Kelly going forward.
Likewise. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So with that, let's pivot to what the Food and Drug Administration has been doing to try to enhance clinical trial diversity. And I'm very grateful to be able to welcome in Jamie Gamerman. And let me pull up Jamie's bio here so you all know Jamie. Jamie is the Senior Policy Advisor at the FDA, and more specifically within the Office of Medical Policy and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, that's CDER. And there within the Office of Medical Policy, she advises the team on regulatory policy issues and has spent plenty of time over the last several years on clinical trial diversity. So we have the expert within the agency joining us this evening to tell us about all the fantastic things the FDA has been doing. So Jamie, with that, why don't I hand it to you?
All right, thank you so much, Paul and Michelle and Sean. It was a pleasure hearing you speak. I agree with everything you said, so you really did a great job kicking us off, and I'll try not to repeat too much of the fantastic information you already provided. But good evening, my name is Jamie Gamerman, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Medical Policy at FDA. I'm really happy to be here tonight to discuss clinical trial diversity from the FDA perspective. For those of you who are new to the topic, I'll provide a little background, and some of this might be a repeat of what Michelle said, but I'll add it in there anyway. So clinical trials provide a crucial evidence base for evaluating whether a medical product is safe and effective. At the FDA, we recognize that the US population is becoming increasingly diverse. There are certain populations, excuse me, that are at times excluded from clinical trials without strong clinical or scientific justification, including older adults, children, those at the extremes of the weight range, and those with multiple conditions or certain infections such as HIV. There are also many enrollment and retention barriers facing trial participants, which I know Michelle and Sean both mentioned. As many of you are aware, for patients with rare diseases, clinical trial enrollment can be particularly challenging. The number of patients is more limited, and the patients are often geographically dispersed, with travel limitations related to their disease. Patient advocacy organizations can engage with sponsors in the drug development process and help recommend trial designs that can better work for the patients. It's our belief at FDA that the enrollment in clinical trials should reflect the diversity of the population that will ultimately use the medical product if approved. This does not mean that trials should have, for example, a 50-50 split between males and females. A clinical trial for a prostate cancer drug will not enroll any females, while a drug to treat postpartum depression will not enroll any males. Certain diseases and also certain drugs disproportionately affect particular races. As an example, in 2005, FDA approved Bidil, which was specifically approved for the treatment of heart failure in patients who identified as Black. FDA has a long-standing commitment to promoting diversity and inclusion of underrepresented populations in clinical trials, and I will share with you today just a sampling of FDA's efforts in this regard. Next slide. There's my standard disclaimer. Next slide. One of the ways that FDA has worked to improve clinical trial diversity is through the publication of policy and guidance documents. And these are all publicly available, and I'm happy to share links with all of you after my presentation. In the interest of time, I'll fast forward to 2020, but FDA's guidance documents on clinical trial diversity go back much farther than that. In November of 2020, FDA published the Enhancing the Diversity of Clinical Trial Populations, Eligibility Criteria, Enrollment Practices, and Trial Designs Final Guidance, which discusses broadening eligibility criteria. And when I say eligibility criteria, I'm referring to the characteristics that a trial participant must have to participate in a clinical trial, which you'll often hear people refer to as exclusion and inclusion criteria. The guidance also discusses avoiding unnecessary exclusions for clinical trials, designing trials that are accessible, improving trial recruitment so that the participants enrolled in trials will better reflect the population most likely to use the medical product while maintaining safety and effectiveness standards, and applying the recommendations to clinical trials of drugs intended to treat rare diseases or conditions. If you're new to the subject of clinical trial diversity, I recommend that you start with this guidance. It provides a great overview of why diversity is important, why it has been a challenge, and how we can all do better. This guidance also has an appendix with some of those older guidance documents I just mentioned, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. FDA also published 2 podcasts with easy to follow infographics on this guidance, and you might hear a familiar voice on one of them. One for industry and a first of its kind specifically tailored for patients. I highly recommend them. Next slide. FDA has also published guidances that are not specifically on clinical trial diversity, but will help advance the cause. FDA's Decentralized Clinical Trials for Drugs, Biological Products, and Devices provides recommendations for trials where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. These activities may take place at the homes of trial participants or in local healthcare facilities that are more convenient, which will open clinical trials for people who were previously unable to participate for many reasons, including scheduling difficulties and their geographic distance from clinical trial sites. Next slide. FDA's final guidance considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biological products also promotes clinical trial diversity by recommending more efficient recruitment through electronic health records and identifying potential trial sites and participants. Next slide. This guidance also builds on our final guidance, Digital Health Technologies for Remote Data Acquisition in Clinical Investigations. Digital health technologies allow transmission of data remotely from trial participants wherever they are located, which again opens up clinical trials to individuals who were previously unable to participate due to geographic distance from the trial site, transportation issues, among other challenges. Next slide. And last year, we actually published a final guidance specific to rare diseases titled Rare Diseases, Considerations for the Development of Drugs and Biological Products, which, among other recommendations, provides additional considerations for the inclusion of rare disease patients in clinical trials. Next slide. And most recently, in January, FDA updated its collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials and clinical studies for FDA-regulated medical products. This guidance describes the standard terminology to use in FDA submissions to describe a patient's race and ethnicity. Think of the forms you fill out at the doctor's office and how limiting the descriptors of race and ethnicity can be. With this guidance, FDA encourages the use of more detailed racial and ethnic categories. There's so many more guidance documents on the topic of clinical trial diversity, but in the interest of time, I will move on. So without Congress's help and the help of Congresswoman Kelly, FDA is limited in what we can do. We can't require a certain trial composition, and there is no formula for diversity that will be applicable for every trial. So in 2022, as Michelle discussed, Congress passed the DEPICT Act, thanks in part to Congresswoman Kelly, which contains many requirements to facilitate greater clinical trial diversity, including in rare disease trials. And they are certainly putting us to work, but among these requirements are the requirements for sponsors to submit a diversity action plan for later phase drug and device trials. As Michelle mentioned, these plans must include the sponsor's goals for enrollment in the clinical study, their rationale for such goals, and an explanation of how they intend to meet these goals. FDA will be publishing a highly anticipated guidance document on diversity action plans any minute now, which I'm not allowed to tell you anything about, but please stay tuned, and it should be publishing anytime now. Well, guidance documents are just one tool that FDA uses to promote clinical trial diversity. Transparency is another key element to our commitment to improving diverse and inclusive participation in clinical trials. And this goes along with the diversity action plans guidance I just mentioned. Next slide. In 2015, FDA developed the drug trial snapshots as part of an overall agency effort to make demographic data more available and clearer to the public. The drug trial snapshots provide consumers and healthcare professionals with concise information about who participated in clinical trials that supported the FDA approval of new drugs, and highlights whether there were any differences observed in the benefits and side effects among demographic groups such as sex, race, and age groups. Next slide. FDA published a 5-year summary report of demographic data from pivotal trials for 231 novel drugs approved between 2015 and 2019, representing 292,766 clinical trial participants. I encourage all of you to take a look. And next slide. There are a lot of colorful charts and graphs, such as the graphs displayed here, that paint a clearer picture on the state of clinical trial diversity. Next slide. In 2023, my center, the Center for Drugs Evaluation and Research, approved 55 novel therapies for a broad range of diseases, and more than half of these therapies were for the treatment of rare diseases. Approximately 44,000 patients participated in these trials. While many programs were able to enroll diverse participants, there were many others where representation for certain underrepresented populations remained low, and it's particularly in rare disease trials. FDA has many other initiatives to encourage clinical trial diversity. Next slide. FDA's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity developed the Enhance Equity Initiative, which highlights research projects and communication resources to advance clinical trial diversity. Additionally, the initiative seeks to understand diverse patient perspectives, preferences, and unmet needs. Next slide. Women's health issues have been all over the news recently, and FDA's Office of Women's Health is on top of it in its efforts to promote the inclusion of females in clinical trials. And these are just two of many offices at FDA that contribute to our overall clinical trial diversity efforts. Next slide. FDA loves engaging with the public on this topic, and so do I. Last year, FDA held a virtual public workshop in response to the DEPICT Act to enhance clinical study diversity. We just released a publicly available report of this workshop on Tuesday. And this past March, in observance of Rare Disease Week, FDA hosted Rare Disease Day, a virtual public meeting where clinical trial participation for patients with rare diseases was discussed in greater detail. Next slide. Well, needless to say, it has been and continues to be a busy year at the FDA, but we look forward to continuing our work on promoting clinical trial diversity. And with that, I'll turn it back to Paul, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Awesome, Jamie. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. It really goes to show just about everything that the FDA has been doing over these last, not just handful of years, as you point out, has been doing for quite a while now in trying to enhance clinical trial diversity. So very appreciative of the overview there. Just before we get into the questions for Jamie, as a heads up, again, in the chat, we put the link to sending a letter to your congresspeople about the NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act. If you haven't clicked on that link quite yet, please consider doing so, and sending around to friends and family as well. To be sending a letter to their representatives. And just generally speaking, to get to know us better, if this is perhaps the first time that you're joining us on one of our MDA Advocacy Institutes, you can go to mda.org/advocacy, where a lot of the work that we do, you can read up about there and see what we've been active within. You can contact us at advocacy@mdausa.org and to join our grassroots network, in which you'll get monthly updates from us. You'll get invitations to advocacy institutes such as these, as well as late breaking news and other advocacy opportunities. You can text MDA USA to 50457. So with that, Jamie, I'm going to actually start with a statement from Bill that really does underscore why this is so important. Bill says that we must make trials available to all of us who can hang on to the hope and promise of the medical community. We can't be ignored just because we have aged out of trials or whatever the reason may be that an individual does not qualify. That can help us and lessen the burden that our disabilities cause for us, but for those who bear the burden or for our basic needs. So that's very well said, Bill, and really does again underscore the reasons for why we are advocating in this area to make clinical trials more diverse. I should also mention that Guinevere has asked just about when you were saying it, Jamie, when is the final DAP guidance coming out? And Guinevere even knows the acronym for Diversity Action Plan for that matter. So she's been paying attention. And I know you said you can't tell us when it's coming out, but from the sounds of it, very soon. So we were hoping it could have been out by this evening. It's not, but Jamie, maybe we'll welcome you back for another Advocacy Institute to go over that when it comes out. How about that?
I'm happy to come back. It's with the White House now, I can say that, but it should be publishing any day now.
There you go. So a question that I wanted to pose to you, within the neuromuscular disease community, there are, in a sense, for certain of the muscular dystrophies in particular, but other genetic diseases within the neuromuscular disease area, there are kind of genetic diversity, if you will, and that the genetic nature of a condition will lead to there being sometimes a lot more males than females, or a lot younger rather than older, or things of that nature where, take Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for example, the vast majority of individuals affected with a dystrophinopathy, such as Becker muscular dystrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they're male. And so that can kind of leave women or girls who also experience Becker or Duchenne muscular dystrophy oftentimes out of clinical trials. So as the FDA is kind of approaching clinical trial diversity more generally, I'm not going to ask you to comment on Duchenne or Becker specifically, but just more generally in genetic diversity or diseases in which there are very small subpopulations within the overall disease that's oftentimes left out of clinical trials because they are a small subpopulation. How is the FDA approaching that challenge?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and we are looking at powering clinical trials with the right population, meaning if a disease skews more male, we'd have more males in the trial. Also acknowledging that there are females who have this disease. And I can say that we have two guidances coming out. This is public information, not sharing any insider secrets here, but we have two guidances coming out on sex differences, one from the drugs perspective and one from the devices perspective. And that should be coming out soon. And we have a lot of recommendations in there about how to, at least from the sex component, address some of these differences, because as you mentioned, these have a great impact on the drugs and how they're approved and their indications and their doses. As an example, a popular sleep drug, Ambien, which a lot of you might have heard of, actually the labeling is different for females than it is for males because there's just a different the way we break down the drug in our bodies is just different. So we offer a lot of policy documents to try to encourage sponsors to look at their trials, who's in the trials, and why they're having trouble getting in them, and hopefully with the diversity action plans that are coming out, we'll start to see a difference there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, yeah, thank you for that answer. And there's additional questions within the chat pertaining to clinical trials for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And for those who are familiar with limb-girdle, you know that's a very general clinical term. There are 34, I believe, individual genetically divided limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. And consequently, any one of those limb-girdle muscular dystrophies can be quite rare. We're talking just a handful of individuals. Now, there is some therapeutic development happening in some of the limb girdles. LGMD2I is moving forward with a number of clinical trials in the sarcoglycanopathies. There's some gene therapies being developed. There's some ongoing development in 2A and 2B, I believe, as well. But Kristen, I believe it's you who have said that you have LGMD2N, which I do believe is one of the rare LGMDs. So this is a long windup, Jamie, for a question to you about those very rare diseases in which it's going to be very difficult to power a trial, and sometimes you may see a company having to make tough choices just to power that trial. In those balancing of those tensions between just trying to get enough folks in the trial, but then also trying to ensure that it's diverse, is there a way in which FDA is approaching that tension, and in whether it's actually advising companies or just in the guidance documents that have been put out in those rarest of rare diseases in which diversity may not be the first thing that's coming to mind as a company is just trying to get that 30th person to enroll that they need to actually power that trial?
Right. I mean, it's a challenge. Some of the guidances I mentioned are helping to push for some change with digital health technologies, meaning like wearable devices, like think of Fitbit and things like that, that can transmit data remotely, or using real world evidence. So, this is evidence from outside of the clinical trial. We also, I know we talked about the Right to Try program. I also did a lot of work on that, so we can talk about that sometime. But FDA also has the Expanded Access program, and that's a way to get access to drugs outside of the clinical trial space. And I will say that FDA approves, I think it's 99% of expanded access applications. So that's a really great way for patients with rare diseases to, with their physician's help, to try to access some drugs for conditions that maybe they weren't able to participate in a clinical trial.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. For those who perhaps did not meet the inclusion criteria of the trial, it's been incumbent on organizations such as ourselves, but the community more generally, to be primarily encouraging the company, who is those who are deciding whether to actually run an expanded access portion along with the clinical trial, to offer expanded access to the medication that's in the clinical trial. So it's a very good point, Jamie, that's one of the ways in which those who are excluded from trials could still potentially get the investigational therapy in question, to then help those who are actually receiving the therapy to represent a more diverse group within the community. So it's a good callback to that point, is that actually expanded access can help address diversity issues. I have another question, and this one comes from Pete. And that the question is, have there been or are there any national campaigns in the works to promote participation in clinical trials, something that will reach underrepresented populations and can address trials for all diseases? Now, Jamie, I know what FDA can do is of course, in some ways limited in how proactively it can be going out and trying to encourage enrollment, especially within any specific trial. Enrollment in any specific trial is really the job of the company, the sponsor in question, and then the clinicians, the primary investigators, or other clinicians who are participating within the clinical trial. This being said, Pete mentions a national campaign, and FDA does at times run national campaigns. Is there any role in which the FDA has in trying to encourage clinical trials to be more diverse by just amplifying the opportunity of clinical trials to underrepresented individuals or communities that might otherwise not be hearing about clinical trials.
Yeah, well, here I have to give a shout out to NIH. They run the clinicaltrials.gov website, and that's a government-run website where you can find out about any clinical trial in the U.S. that's happening right now. So I definitely recommend everyone to check out clinicaltrials.gov. We have our Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, which I mentioned, and they're always doing we're staying away from the term stakeholders. We're using interested party outreach to try to reach patients and patient advocacy organizations. We can't specifically encourage, as you said, enrollment in specific clinical trials, but we're here to tell sponsors how to do it and to recommend that sponsors do it. We're looking at providing literature in multiple languages so people that don't speak English aren't excluded from clinical trials. We're encouraging recruitment from non-traditional sites, such as cultural festivals. We're just encouraging outreach any way that sponsors can think to do it. We're encouraging creativity in the way they recruit for clinical trials, and just the enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations guidance I mentioned has all kinds of recommendations, mostly directed at sponsors for how they can reduce these enrollment and retention barriers to help make clinical trials more diverse. So we have our guidance documents, but we do a lot of outreach as well.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, the FDA does. And Pete has a similar question, which he asks, if it's not the FDA that's to be pushing and promoting, let me actually rephrase this just to make sure I'm getting Pete's question right. So many FDA guidance documents, does the FDA push promote their use and understanding by others beyond trial sponsors and those already in the trial world? And if not, is there another agency or organization charged with that? I can at least take the last half of that question. I don't believe there is any other agency that would be specifically responsible for taking FDA's guidances and pushing it to communities or individuals or whoever happens to be beyond the traditional communities, such as those involved in the clinical trial world. And so I don't believe there's anywhere else, though. Jamie, you gave an appropriate shout out to NIH, given clinicaltrials.gov is the place to go to look to see what clinical trials and expanded access programs are out there. And Mark, thank you for putting clinicaltrials.gov into the chat for anyone who wants to explore and see what clinical trials there may be out there within your neuromuscular condition or the neuromuscular condition that you're particularly interested in. But Jamie, maybe if you want to take a crack at the first half of that question of, are there ways in which FDA is trying to get these really helpful guidance documents out to places that might be harder for those guidance documents to get to?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the podcast that we did on the eligibility guidance, and we're aware, we try our best to write guidance documents in plain English, but we don't always succeed. So the podcasts are a way to help explain these guidance documents. So I highly recommend and I didn't do this one, my colleague did, but the patient focused podcast on the diversity, the eligibility guidance. There's the podcast that's in plain English for patients, and it's paired with this really helpful infographic that helps break it down. This way patients they don't have to read our FDA guidance documents. We know they're sometimes tailored towards industry and people with more familiarity with the topic. So we're doing our best to make sure that patients also understand what opportunities they have, and that FDA hears you. We know you have your challenges, and we're trying to provide resources. And our Office of Minority Health and Health Equity is really the way to go. If you go on their webpage, they have resources in several different languages for patients and links to clinical trials and how to get more involved. So I definitely recommend you check that out.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great plug. So for everybody listening in, head to the Office of Minority Health for all the excellent offers or all the excellent things that they offer. And then we do appreciate the podcasts, so that we listen to those frequently. And you are correct; they are easier to listen to than reading an FDA guidance, even though FDA guidances are comparatively readable to Federal Register notices or things of that nature. But the communications, such as the podcasts or other things that the agency's been putting out that are a little bit more digestible are indeed very helpful. And so appreciate those that the agency does. David has a question, and Jamie, I know I'm just peppering you with questions here, so
That's
if you're
totally
like
fine.
that's enough, I'm out of here. Let me know, but if not, I have maybe just one or two more for you
No,
here.
go for it.
David has a question. We earlier just mentioned male-female sex diversity, but then he also asks about gender diversity and how that may be handled in the context of clinical trials. And he says, how do chosen genders affect access to trials and/or responses to treatments? So it's a complex question for sure. But within those guidance documents that you went through, is gender also included in the discussion that the agency is putting forward?
Well, I'm not allowed to talk a lot more about it, but we do have a sex differences guidance coming out, and gender's in there. So there's more information to come. I can't unfortunately share the content of that
We're not going to
guidance.
get you in trouble, Jamie. I
Don't
mean,
get me in trouble here, but
a
we're aware of
different
gender
host might really
issues.
try to, yeah, a different host might really try to prod you right now to get as much information out of you, but that's not us. We don't want you to get in trouble with the agency or anyone else. Just for everybody who's listening, and remember that guidance will be coming out. Now, that guidance might not be on the same schedule as the diversity action plan as
No, it should
in
be
a
coming
minute
out
now.
soon, date to be determined, but we have a guidance agenda that we publish, and that's publicly available, and that's why I can tell you that it is on there. It's a publicly available agenda, and if you look for it, you'll see all the other guidance documents that we hope to publish sometime this calendar year.
Yeah, and that was the point I was just going to emphasize. That agenda is published each year, so that means that we can expect, generally speaking, that guidance should come out at some point this year. So whether it's a week from now or sometime in December, this calendar year, we can expect for that draft guidance to be published. So to your question, David, there may be some conversation in there, in addition to sex differences, about gender differences as well. So keep an eye out for that. Just one additional question that we received I wanted to get to, and this is from Dr. Brooks. And Dr. Brooks says that Medicare pays for cancer clinical trials. Is this true for neuromuscular clinical trials? So I can take the first crack at this one. And by and large, our understanding of clinical trials at their intersection with Medicare is that while Medicare will pay for the participants' routine and or otherwise covered services that might intersect with the clinical trial. For example, if an individual maybe needs an MRI to assess whether they qualify, if blood needs to be drawn, if certain levels need to be checked in order to potentially qualify, if those are services that are otherwise covered by the Medicare program, then Medicare will frequently pay for those services to happen. Now, what the Medicare program generally does not cover, though, is the investigational therapy itself. Medicare is not in the business of covering non-FDA approved therapies. They generally need to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration for Medicare to pay for them. And it's my understanding that goes, generally speaking, for clinical trials as well. Now, there is coverage with evidence determination. That's a Medicare program that allows for Medicare to cover a therapy, but only in the context of a clinical trial, or they cover it, and then a clinical trial must also be conducted simultaneously to confirm the whatever Medicare wants to confirm within the context of that clinical trial. But by and large, especially for neuromuscular disease clinical trial or rare disease clinical trials, Medicare is not paying for those. Those, at least in my awareness, are being paid for, of course, by the sponsor themselves in order for those trials to continue. Jamie, is there anything you'd want to add to that? I understand Medicare is probably not your focus most days, but anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to add that we do have information on our website about compensation and how that works in clinical trials. It's different from payment, but they will compensate for certain costs related to the clinical trial. So participation for financial reasons is not a barrier to your participation. So we do have some information on our website about that.
Yeah, well said. So just to round us out, and we have about 5 minutes left in our hour here, and we've had quite the number of questions. And again, so grateful for everybody asking all of these questions to me and to Jamie. These are really fantastic questions. I'm just going to try to resolve perhaps two more here, and this will be my final call for any final questions that you have for me and Jamie before we call it an evening for all of us. There was a question about which SMA therapy would be best for you, and of course that's a question that you have to work out with your clinician and your care team. That's not something that either we at MDA can do, as we do not give medical advice, nor of course something that Jamie can answer. So certainly, if you're seeing a clinician at an MDA care center, certainly encourage you to work with them on which of the approved SMA therapies may be best for you, if any of them are appropriate for you for that matter. So I just wanted to make sure that that question didn't go unanswered. And then finally, we have a question for Lynn, from Lynn, pertaining to getting beyond the kind of traditional PIs, because Jamie, as you probably know, within rare diseases, it's generally speaking going to be the same trial sites and the same PIs for nearly any therapy that's going to be being tested. And so Lynn's question is, how can we get beyond those same PIs? And I'll start, Lynn, by just saying that it's incumbent on all of us to try to expand the number of expert clinicians and also centers that can potentially participate within clinical trials. One way in which we at MDA are trying to do that, and this is specific to ALS, is through passing the ALS Better Care Act, because many care centers that currently do not actually participate within clinical trials do not participate because they just financially can't afford to do so. Their staff are so already committed with the obligations of their multidisciplinary care center, and that they can't hire more staff because the staff they have are incredibly undercompensated and undercovered by the Medicare program, that clinical trials just simply do not happen at those centers where the traditional PIs that we're all familiar with are operating. So instead, we are trying to, by passing the ALS Better Care Act, we are going to compensate all ALS multidisciplinary care centers appropriately so that they have the option to participate within clinical trials more frequently. That expands the number of PIs who can participate. That is a way in which, at least specifically within ALS, we can get beyond the just traditional handful of ALS PIs that we all know who traditionally actually run clinical trials that we're familiar with. So that's just one thing I would mention, Lynn, as a way in which we're trying to expand the bench of PIs that participate within clinical trials. That's specific to ALS, but we're trying in other ways in other neuromuscular conditions. Jamie, I know that was a very ALS-specific answer, and Mark, thank you for adding the way for you to support the ALS Better Care Act attendees. Thank you for Mark for putting that in the chat. But Jamie, anything else you'd want to add to how to diversify the PIs that are actually participating within these clinical trials?
And I apologize. What is your acronym PI? It's not one that we.
Primary investigator. I'm sorry.
Primary. Okay. Because we don't normally use that acronym.
No, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we don't normally. We have a lot of acronyms at FDA, so I definitely get the use of different acronyms. We would love to diversify investigators, because it's our belief that if investigators look more like the patients, and we have a better chance of diversifying the clinical trial. So that's something that we do mention in our eligibility criteria guidance, and getting the people that are working in the clinical trials to look more like the patients themselves. And that's one of the ways that we're hoping to improve clinical trial diversity.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, with that, look at that. We are right at the hour. Jamie, you and I covered a lot of ground here at the end. So I appreciate all of the answers to the many fantastic questions coming from our community on clinical trial diversity. And of course, grateful for all the great work that the agency is doing to try to make clinical trials more diverse. And we're very much looking forward to when the Diversity Action Plan guidance does eventually drop here any day now. And as I said, maybe we'll invite you back to talk about that in the not so distant future. But for now, Jamie, again, thank you for the time this evening. And again, everybody, thank you for the time this evening. Please do join us at mda.org/advocacy. Email us at advocacy@mdausa.org. Send that letter to your representative and senators about NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act. And to join us more generally, text MDA USA to 50457. And with that, I wish everyone a happy rest of your Thursday evening. Thanks all.
Thank you.